November 7th. Well, November 7th, 1917 was the beginning of the October Revolution in Russia. Um, so, TDIH, October 7th. October 7th, 2020, here we are to talk about westward expansion. Some of this I've done already. I want to try to get through it as quickly as possible. Ideally, get done in 20 minutes. So, probably not going to happen. Let's see. All right, you've seen this beginning stuff already. I don't need to go through it too much, right? Manifest destiny is the word of the day here in the time period 1820s to the 1840s. As I said in class, right, this is not a new idea. People have been pushing west and expropriating native land, killing Native Americans for centuries. Um, but the idea, or the term manifest destiny, rather, is coined in 1845 by O'Sullivan, John O'Sullivan. And the main takeaway here is you know what it is. Think about the word, right? What is to make something manifest, to make it real? Destiny, right? What is your destiny? Unpack that phrase. Don't just say, oh, manifest destiny, manifest destiny. Unpack it. Think about what it means. It's really like a very important concept that people really believed in, right? And that's the idea of that. Okay, the term is coined in 1845. It actually makes manifest something that has been happening for a very long time. It gives a right. It adds a label to something that has been ongoing. The main idea here is there's three parts to it, right? There's a religious aspect. The Anglo-Saxons are God's chosen people, so they can go out and do genocides and take native land. Two is a economic concept from John Locke. Native Americans aren't using the land properly, right? They don't even believe in private property. Heathens, right? So there's that. You need to own the land and develop it in order to make it yours. And then lastly is the political element, which is this long-standing vision of right westward expansion, yeoman farmers, coast to coast kind of thing. Jefferson. All right, this is the image in the book. We don't have to belabor it. I went over it already in class. Um, let's get into the book. There's a lot going on in this chapter. It kind of doesn't make a whole lot of sense because it talks about white Southerners and black Southerners and Southern culture, and then it's like Western expansion and all this kind of stuff. And it doesn't talk about the Northern like counterpart, which is weird. However, if you want to think big picture, this is what's going on, right? There's stuff happening in the South and it gets pushed west, right? So it's not just Southern culture, it's not just Northern culture that gets pushed west, it's also Southern culture. I'll get in. I'm getting ahead of myself here. Okay, in the book, The White South. If you're white, right, you have at the top of the top the elite enslavers. I don't know what your book calls them, elite something or others. They're right enslavers. They have people as property. They claim that they are the inheritors of Greek and Roman culture. Right? The Romans had slaves, Greeks had slaves. They're an aristocracy. We're an aristocracy. I think it's all good. And they don't just defend what they're saying by saying like, and we're racist too, and that's fine by us. That's cool. And if you don't like it, big deal. No, right? They are saying that they are defending freedom, right? That they are the real Democrats. They're defending democracy against these radical activists, these radical Northern abolitionists, et cetera, et cetera. So again, it's not that they're just like racist. They are racist, no doubt about that, but they don't like defend their position by just like owning, like soaking in their racism. They're defending it through other rhetorical strategies that are not necessarily wrong insofar as that you do have a right private property rights. It's there. As far as democracy is concerned, only 10% of Athens voted, and they had slaves, so they got a point there too. And that's what they argue is right the power of their culture, and they deserve to be at the top, right? The elites. They obviously benefit incredibly from the racial by the racial animus between poor white and poor black, right? So if poor white and poor black, they're both poor. They don't have any property. They live really, season to season, crop to crop. Um, uh, they have a very hard time moving forward. Obviously, black laborers are enslaved and the white are free, but economically they have a lot in common. So they are told at every chance that they can get that race matters, and the elite enslavers benefit from that. In the middle here, you have these kind of small freeholders there, the yeoman farmers. They have a very hard time surviving, right? For them, the American dream is to enslave black laborers. Again, sounds pretty bad, is pretty bad. Sounds like they're racist. They are racist. However, keep in mind why they are positioned in the way that they are, right? In the South, okay, sure, we have this vision of yeoman farmers, right? Planting crops, harvesting crops, providing for themselves and their families. That's done. By the 1820s and 30s, if you're not growing cotton, right, you're not going to make money, right? So everyone needs to grow cotton. That is the agriculture in the South. And in order for these small freeholders to compete, they have to have enslaved laborers. They can't pay laborers. They can't do it themselves. So what are they going to do? They have to strive for this idea of, right, you enslave one person, two people, more and more, you buy more land, and then you move up the very stout social ladder of the South. This is a losing proposition. They are not going to win here, right? The system is set up against them. Again, you can be sympathetic or not. They're certainly like they're racist, but it's important to understand how they fit in a larger structure that is structurally racist, right? So if you're a small freeholder, you have no choice, right? You are almost literally invested in white supremacy because you have to do these things in order to survive, right? So that is the structure of Southern society. At the very bottom, you have the poor freemen, and what they have going for them, they're not slaves. Otherwise, they have it pretty bad. They have no advantages except their race. In the North, we have public schools that are taxpayer funded. There's all kinds of training programs. There's all kinds of stuff that they don't have in the South because Southerners don't want to pay taxes. And, if you're an elite enslaver, you can just have a private tutor, right? Teach your kids. You don't need to, pay taxes to fund some kind of public education. So they're in bad shape. This social system works perfectly well, right? So if we think back to 1676, Bacon's Rebellion, remember the black codes, all the anti-black laws, chattel slavery is passed after this rebellion. The rebellion is poor white and poor black, free and indentured and enslaved, fighting together. If you're the elite enslavers at the top of that pyramid, you want to make sure that you have the stability to keep you at the top of the pyramid. And how do you do that? You make sure that white and black aren't getting along. Poor white, poor black do not get along. Slavery is obviously one major way to do that, to make a permanent bottom rung on the social ladder. But also this idea of having to actually invest, even if you, right, are in this kind of middling territory, you have to invest in slavery. Literally and psychologically, you have to invest in it to survive. That's structural racism. The Black South, all coming at you at once. Did I really intend to do this? No, I didn't. Okay, a note here on dialect. It is incorrigible what the book does. The book introduces you to dialect, which is to say quoted speech from enslaved or formerly enslaved Black Americans that is written in dialect. Dat instead of that. And all of these other various kind of colloquialisms that read like when you're reading it, it makes you a racist, right? Because you're reading it in this stereotypical like black accent or whatever. The book kind of just throws this at you without any context. A couple pages in, they say something about Gullah Geechee dialect or whatever. It is unconscionable that they do this. Dialect transcription, and the passages that we have in the book, presumably they don't cite any sources, so I'd dock them points on that one if it was a DBQ. Dialect transcription is from the WPA, which is a 1930s, the Works Progress Administration. We'll learn about it later. It was a New Deal program that got people to go out and record the stories of formerly enslaved people who were still alive in the 1930s, right? If you were born in the 1860s, presumably you could still, right, be able to be very old. But a lot of these people who went around and recorded it in what they, right, thought was the accurate, they're white, right? So white interviewer goes out, gets a story and writes it in this dialect, right? Which is a kind of like, black American accent. It's been written about all kinds of different ways of how it's problematic and this, that, the other. I just can't get over the fact that the book kind of does that to you as you read it without any kind of context or introduction. If you want to talk more about it, it's like a really big deal. But is it going to be on the AP exam? No. What do they care about real history? Okay. Free blacks, not many of them in the South. So let's just get that over with. There are free blacks in the, if it was a college class or something we could get into, we could have a whole semester about free blacks in the South, but we're not doing that. Okay, so enslaved labor, how do they create a culture? Well, part of their culture is what we might say kind of working class, right? Now, they are not working class because they're enslaved. It's a totally different thing. But they understand that they have power in their labor. They can slow things down if they work together. They can speed things up if they work together. They can stop altogether, right, if they work together. That in their and they're very connected because they're all enslaved. They have a very strong sense that part of their power comes from their working class identity, right? And they know they're not going to become, right, yeomen. They're not going to move, there's no American dream if you're enslaved, right? You're just this thing forever, right? So that actually creates a kind of culture of kind of working class idea of that they have power in how they work and how they work together or don't work, work hard or don't work hard. So that's a big part of black culture in the South, is the fact that they actually have far more power over their labor than any white enslaver does, right? Okay, black culture is defined by a couple things. The first one I'll talk about is region. In Virginia, you have a fairly self-sustaining population. Hence the internal migration, right? 2.5 million enslaved Africans sold from Virginia, Maryland, Delaware down to the Deep South. That's how many, right, enslaved laborers there are. So it's a self-sustaining population, and it leads to a kind of African / American kind of culture. The book at some points again here says, I don't know who wrote this chapter, man. Says African American. They're not. If you are not African American, I mean, again, this is like my little pedantic thing, but to suggest that you're African American suggests that you're a citizen, right? Asian American, African American, right? Whatever. That means you're an American citizen. We can colloquially say, right, oh, African Americans or whatever, but strictly speaking, these are enslaved Africans or enslaved black laborers or what have you. But they're not African American. So this, when I'm talking about the culture, it's African culture plus American culture. A lot of the Southern kind of Baptist, Methodist, a lot of the kind of black church traditions come out of Virginia, as opposed to South Carolina, which also Emmanuel AME is a black church tradition in South Carolina. But largely it's different from Virginia insofar as with a constant influx of African and Caribbean laborers, you have a different culture. It's a kind of Pan-African culture. The dialect is different, right? There's words and sentence structures that are far more African influenced. There's all kinds of more Caribbean, African culture happening in South Carolina than in Virginia. Deep South, a totally other thing, right? It's pretty early days in the Deep South. These are laborers that are 3 times displaced, first from Africa to the New World, then from the New World, uh, Virginia or South Carolina to the Deep South. So they're just beginning to forge their culture. Some things that do persist across region, certain African traditions. One, fictive kinship. This is something that was common in West Africa anyway, fictive kinship. This is something that, like, I mean, if you're South Asian or Asian or black in the United States, you have, aunties and uncles that aren't actually your aunts and uncles, right? This is the kind of idea. This is fictive kinship. So you have, oh, this auntie or that auntie or whatever. And they're not really blood relatives, but they're like your aunt or your uncle or whatever, right? That is something that is very common in this time period in slave culture, right? Fictive kinship. And obviously it's even more important because you have the actual like blood relations can be torn apart. People can be sold off here, sold off there. So fictive kinship is very, very important. Their diet is very advanced. Again, all of the restrictions of slavery, it's terrible, right? They don't get enough to eat. They have to forage for food. However, one of the things that is a legacy of African foodways, as it's known, is like eating a lot of vegetables, a lot of leafy greens, chili pepper. So like stuff that white people were not eating in the South, like vegetables. Vegetables, people thought vegetables were bad for you. So they just ate like meat and butter and milk, like not good for your digestive system. So in terms of diet, that was very advanced. And then obviously, as your book points out, incest taboo. White people in the South, if you're rich, cousins. Cousin marriage, keep it in the family. Keep all the wealth in the family. That seems like a great idea, guys. You're really, working on all cylinders. No, incest taboo, not good. It's a West African thing. It's a common sense thing that enslaved Africans were very keen of. Rich Southerners, not so much. Like the Habsburgs. You see those pictures of the Habsburgs, and it's like, it's a Habsburg when they got the chin way big like this. I guess that's what happens when you marry your cousins. Okay, Black culture. The second thing that Black culture is defined by is occupation. So it's not just by region, it's also by occupation. If you worked in the big house, you were considered in the Black community, right? The enslaved community, you were higher class, right? Your work was easier. You had more privileges. If you were a woman, you were also more subject to sexual violence, so that was not a privilege. Hence, right, them often being lighter skinned, right, because of the influence of kind of white sexual violence on Black women. Their children would be, right, lighter skinned, still a slave, half white, half Black, quarter white, 3/4 Black, still enslaved. Where if you worked in the field, you were further away. It was physical labor, gang labor, task labor, what have you. Often darker skinned, not just because you were out in the field, but because you were separated from the white community. And this does lead to, in some ways, what we would call colorism, right? So colorism is like racism, but racism of like people of color on people of color. So it's not just like racism like white, like mainstream society being racist against, right, a person of color, but rather the idea that if you were enslaved and you were lighter skinned, you were better than someone who was enslaved and was darker skinned. This is something that persists even into the modern era in the Black community and in other communities. So for example, in East Asia, there's a similar kind of colorism thing of like lighter skin, darker skin. It's a very different history there. It's about who was a peasant and who working in the sun and who wasn't. But those are all examples of colorism. And this is what we have here that develops in this time period. I'm gonna get through one last slide and then I'm gonna take a break here. The one last thing I want to say about slavery. The book at some point says something about, this so-and-so, like slave, they even he owned 4 horses and a carriage or whatever. He didn't own nothing. The idea that you own, like, yeah, sure. The enslaved person could have bought 4 horses and a carriage or whatever. But if the person that owned that slave wanted those things, they were his. Right? So like I don't know, again, there's these moments where our book kind of prevaricates and makes it seem like, oh well, some slaves, wasn't that bad. They owned things. No, they didn't. If you were owned by someone else, you could have theoretically, a couple pigs or whatever, but if the your owner wanted it, it was theirs, right? So again, I don't know what the book is doing here. I'll stop there on that low point, and then we'll move to Manifest Destiny, Southern style.